guys, welcome back. Part 3 of Project New York. So in this video, we're going to put back together the complete front end suspension with the wishbone, the steering rack, the stabilizer bar. If you missed the previous episodes in part 1, we completely took down the car, broke it down, we saw exactly what was wrong. Part 2, we started taking apart what was broken, seeing what needed to be replaced. And now part 3, the parts have finally arrived. We got 2 springs and struts, we got a steering rack. We're going to reuse the same stabilizer bar because it is still in good shape. We have all brand new hardware because you have to renew the bolts, and a brand new wishbone because the old one took a pretty bad beating if you saw in part 1 and 2. If you have rear wheel drive, your car won't have the front CV axles, so this job will be 5 times easier. If you do, which this car does, I will show you exactly what to do to put your struts back into the car. All right, let's put it back together. First thing we're going to install is the strut and the brace. If you look at your strut here, you'll see a little tooth. This lines up with this gap, so it aligns, so you'll be able to put it in place correctly. Make sure which one is left or right when you're installing this. These two are supposed to line up, and vice versa for the left side. And once that is flush to the bottom, take your 60mm bolt and just fasten it down. We'll go ahead and torque all this down later when the car's at ride height, so everything goes in correctly. Seal that in and do the same for the other one. Now to install the spring all the way, put this on the wishbone. Now there's only one problem with the X-Drive car. You have your CV axle in the way. So when you put your spring in, you'll go ahead and clear it, but then when you want to put it in from the top, it'll just go ahead and hit against your CV axle, and that's not good. The easiest way to get around that is to remove the 17mm bolt. Of course, you want to pull out the big ones for this one because that sucker is torqued down to 210 Newton meters, so you need something powerful to pull that one out. So go ahead and get your Milwaukee. I freaking love this thing. Wow, that was pretty simple. Now all you have to do, pull your CV axle out of the way, and now you'll have all that clearance when you want to put in your strut. Next, we're putting in our wishbone. Seat it in place, and brand new hardware. Put your bolt straight through, all the way through, and fasten it with the nut. Don't lock your wishbone to the wheel yet because you have to put your CV axle in prior to doing that. Now before we do any of that, we have to put the strut in, then lock it with the wishbone, spring, and our strut, and secure it with the 3 bolts on top. Feed the spring into the car and secure it with the 3 E12 torque bolts that are up top. And then tighten the 3 bolts on top, but not too much. We're just going to tighten it so we can hold the spring strut for us. And it should look something like this. Next, we connect our CV axle to the wheel hub. You want to bring it right in between the strut support and put it back on the wheel hub. Line up the splines. And lock it with your new Torx bolt. We'll torque that down in a minute. Now we have to get the wishbone connected to the wheel right over here, but there's an issue. This fork here won't let you clear the wishbone arm. You can put it where it belongs. So I've been looking for a while to find a tool that can spread these fork arms together for us, and I found one. These are for brake calipers, but a very, very durable one. So what we're gonna do is put it in between the forks, spread it a little bit, so we're able to clear this bushing that allows us to put this where it belongs back on the wheel. Spreader is really good because you can use a 1/2-inch wrench, keep cranking at it to split this nice and wide. Once the fork clears the wishbone bushings, the wheel hub and the wishbone should connect right up, and then you have a nut that goes right up on top. See, now we can even barely move the spring strut back and forth. We need to spread it a little more so the fork can clear the bushing. This guy a little bit more to level them off. Secure it and put the nut on before you take away your separator tool. Now we can take pressure away from the fork arms. Seated, and the bolt's starting to spin in place. Perfect. Go ahead and tighten the nut down to the wishbone. Once you get to about hand tight, just stop. There you go. Please don't make the mistake of torquing everything while it's not at ride height. It's pretty bad for the bushings. It can wear them out a lot quicker than normal. and it's just not good. You'll feel clunking in the ride. It wouldn't be nice. So ride high is when you torque down everything. Two ways you can do it. You can either do it once the wheel's on and the car's back on the ground, or you could jack it up from the bolt. That seems to be about ride height. There's a lot of pressure on the spring. Now let's torque down the bolts. This bolt has to be torqued down to 90 Newton meters and then 180 degrees of rotation. Highly recommend electric torque wrench. It makes your life so much easier. So it's set at 90 Newton meters. There we go. All right. And now you need to do 180 degrees of rotation. And that reads 90 degrees or 180 degree rotation. Do the same thing for this, same specs apply. What I like to do is tighten the nut on the back until the bolt starts to spin like that. And then I take a wrench, I put it in the bolt, and it'll just work its way up there. And now you can tighten it to hand tight. Torque this down to 90 Newton meters and 180 degree of rotation. Your 3 E12 bolts are tightened down to 28 Newton meters. Once those main components are torqued down, you're allowed to drop the wheel back down and torque the rest of the stuff down. The bolt that holds the wishbone and the wheel hub together, held on by a 24 millimeter nut. You have to torque this down to 90 millimeters. Or excuse me, 90 Newton meters. There you go. Well, it's pretty good to have these tools at hand. The small impact wrench, torque wrench, they really come in handy in these little tight spots. All right. After everything is installed, you should turn your wheel left to right and make sure your CV axle is not touching the fork. If it is, go back and check something. But if it's not, then you did everything right. There you go. Make sure you renew your Torx bolts. These are torqued down to 210 Newton meters and then a 90 degree angle of rotation. Have someone hold the brakes for you or this isn't going to be possible. So down 210 Newton meters. First brake. There we go. And there you go. 17 millimeter bolt. Tighten that down to 56 Newton meters for the fork. And there you go. Let me repeat the same on this side just for the spring, and I'll show you what putting in the steering rack looks like and stabilizer bar. So I was getting ready to install this side and I touched the CV boot just to remove it out of place to fit the spring, and just my luck, it cracked. So fragile, it just cracked and started leaking grease all over the place. Now we need to replace this CV boot. Luckily, it's very simple. What we want to do is cut the CV boot off with a sharp knife so we can replace it. Be ready for a lot of grease for this, by the way. Pull it out and continue cutting the boot so it releases. There you go. And this guy should come out. One of these bearings was actually stuck in the housing and I just pulled it on and snapped it back in place. Thankfully I took this out or that would have been a lot of clunking noises. There's the housing. We just have to remove that band and put in a new one with the boot. I have to run to BMW and pick up a CV boot, the clamps, and a new lock ring. And I'll show you how to do all of that. Unfortunately, it's 2 in the morning. Nothing is open right now, so I'll have to wait until tomorrow. So it's the next day. I was able to go to BMW and get the repair kit. It comes with the boot, the lock ring, the clamps, and grease. Before removing your smaller band clamp, you're gonna notice on the boot itself, there's 3 letters, A, B, and C. Make sure when you put the new clamp on, you line it up exactly with the letter that it sits with and exactly on the lines that it lines up with as well. This way you don't throw off the rotation. The best way to get the old clamps off is to get a flathead and find the end of the clamp and simply just put it under it and twist upwards. And do it from both sides so you can clear this little tooth. Pops right out of place. Now you can grab the ear part and pull it out. Next, we have to get the bearings off the shaft, and they're held on by this little lock ring. All we have to do is squeeze it apart, pull it out, and that should come off. And there's that ring. These bearings, you can go ahead and just pull them off the shaft. Just make sure you keep them oriented. Whichever way you took them out is exactly the way they go in. Take your cracked boot and just slide it on. Now we have some cleaning to do. What we have to do is clean the parts out very well before putting them back on the car. We are going to put brake cleaner really thoroughly throughout the bearings and then blow it out with some air compressor to make sure there's nothing in there before putting the grease in. So just go ahead and clean off all the old grease. Parts cleaner. Same thing for the bearings. Wipe any excess grease that's left over and use your air compressor to blow it out. Repeat this until fully clean. You'll probably have to do this about 10 or 11 times just to make sure you get all the grease out. You also have to make sure to clean the CV boot housing thoroughly of all the grease that's inside. Once you get that as clean as possible, we can proceed to take out the clamp. Get the clamp off and remove the rest of that cracked boot. Once you have everything cleaned up and ready to go, you take your CV axle boot housing and you make sure that the holes are pointing towards the transmission side and you put it right into the boot. Just seat it in there, snap it in place, and it should look like this. They should sit flush to each other. You want to take your little band clamp and put it in first. Messy part. You take some of the grease and you put it right at the edge of the shaft so you can slide the boot over. Take your boot, little end first, and slide it over. Just like that. Now we take our bearings and slide them over the shaft. Don't be afraid to use the grease, as we are going to use all of it. Make sure you orient it the right way before putting it in. Go ahead and push it in all the way until you see where you can put your lock ring back on. Take this guy. Once your lock ring is back on, just make sure it spins freely, but not too much, just enough to where you has force of back on the... And now we fill it with grease. Just make sure you get grease in all of the bearings. BMW supplies you with 2 of these. There we go. Just make sure it's rotated nice inside of the ball bearing. Now we take our little clamp, bring it over the boot, and make sure you align it with the letter that I showed you earlier. In my case, it's C, and it's the second line above the C. Go ahead and line it up, and go ahead and it should seal nice and tight. And now it's ready to go back in the car. Clean up any mess that grease left prior to this job. CV boot and the housing can only go in one way. That's why you line up the letters. Go ahead and put it right back in place. The boot over the housing. Once you have the boot and the housing nice and seated, you can either jack up the CV axle or you can just set it on something so you can go ahead and clamp the other band clamp to the CV housing. Wrap the band around the boot and put your clamp back on. Helps to have the tools for it. Now that that's finally situated, now I can put back the spring and now I'll show you how to put the steering rack and the stabilizer bar. Now we can continue with the job. Everything is put back into place, not touching the forks. Everything is solid. Okay, the best way to do it, set it up on a jack and jack it upwards towards the car. Slide it in, slide the steering rack in place, and then you have 2 16mm bolts that hold it. If you look from the driver's side wheel, you'll see the steering shaft and the steering rack touch each other. Just go ahead and slide them on and then put the screw in. Those 2 are held on by that E10 screw. Just make sure you get an extension so you can actually reach all the way in there. And torque it down to 21 Newton meters. And now we can connect our tie rods. Just go ahead and push the wheel forward. Push it through and put the nut on. And do the same for the other side. Next, we have our stabilizer bar. It hooks on right there to the fork on either side. Put the nut on. Leave them loose for now so we can put the stabilizer bar bracket on first. You can put it on a jack, it'll make your life so much easier. Jack it up from the middle, get 2 bar right there. You want to take your bushing covers, put them right over and snap them in place. First one, the second one. Now you can jack it up until these touch the chassis and they line up with the holes. And now we can put our brace back on. Each side will come with 2 long bolts and 1 small one. Just keep in mind, the smallest one goes furthest away from the front of the car for the bracket. Put that guy in, and these 2 are the same size, so it doesn't matter which one you use. These are E16 bolts, by the way. Pretty solid. Bushings are all in place. Bracket is nice and flush. All the way down through. Everything is looking perfect. Now we can connect back our cables. Fairly simple. Just cover it over, snap it on the lines. Take your little connector and put it back in place. There we go. Put everything back where it belongs. Boom, baby. That, my good friends, is how you put together a CV axle, a steering rack, wishbone, suspension, the entire nine, tie rods. Man, part 3 was not bad at all. And there's part 3 of Project New York. Tomorrow, I'm putting the wheels on. We're taking it for a drive. I'll take it for an alignment, make sure everything's in a straight line. To be completely honest, this was a fairly easy job. It's just very time consuming and it's very, very messy. Unfortunately, you have to wait for some parts if you don't have them at your local BMW shop. You have to use OEM parts for this job or things won't go right. We have the spring, everything installed on the passenger side. Everything is installed on the driver's side as well. So stay tuned and keep an eye out for part 4. We have some surprises coming. Alrighty guys, till next time. Peace.
Alright, that's not good. Alright, you guys need to open up. Take a step back. Take a step back. He wants to go for it. Alright, we need to make sure we patch that on video.